Steel trap diplomacy. How China is tightening its grip on South America. Commentary. China's infrastructure push in South America is not a goodwill gesture. It's a calculated strategy to entrench influence, bypass accountability, and reshape sovereignty under the banner of development. From rail corridors to space stations, Beijing is laying down steel and fiber not just to move goods, but to export a governance model rooted in opacity and control. As China's lending and investment portfolio in the region deepens, the line between development partner and shadow rulemaker is getting harder to see. Railways as instruments of control. The proposed interoceanic railway between Brazil and Peru, revived as a Brazil-China bioceanic corridor, linking the Atlantic to Peru's Chancay megaport, is a case in point. Marketed as a trade-enhancing corridor that would bypass the Panama Canal, the multi-billion-dollar project would cut across Amazonian rainforest and indigenous lands on a route that Brazilian and Peruvian officials themselves have flagged as environmentally and socially risky. Environmental groups warn of irreversible damage to fragile ecosystems and livelihoods, while local communities face displacement with little recourse. Yet the project moves forward in fits and starts, choreographed by Chinese state-linked companies and financing, and largely insulated from sustained public oversight. In Chile, the Chile Sobre Riels initiative is framed as neutral modernization. Officially, it is a long-term program to expand passenger and freight rail by 2030. In practice, it leans heavily on Chinese rolling stock and turnkey contracts from companies such as China Railway Rolling Stock Corporation and China Railway Group, which are already supplying trains and construction services across the network. The result is a vertically integrated supply chain that locks Chile into Chinese technical standards, maintenance cycles, and parts over decades. Critics in Chile and Europe have warned that state-subsidized Chinese bids undercut competitors and risk distorting local markets. What looks like infrastructure is, in practice, a strategic tether. Debt diplomacy and strategic leverage. China's overseas lending model is brittle by design. A Stanford University-linked research on China's global lending shows that as of 2022, roughly 60% of China's overseas loans are now owed by borrowers in or near debt distress, a share that has risen sharply over the past decade. A related aid data study finds that nearly half of China's public and publicly guaranteed loans to low- and middle-income countries are backed by collateral arrangements and revenue ring-fencing that leave governments with limited control over their own export earnings. Beijing selectively extends grace periods, rolls over swap lines, or restructures loans, not to promote sustainability, but to preserve leverage and avoid high-profile defaults that would expose the terms of its lending. Chile's rail plan exemplifies this dynamic at a smaller scale. Financing is routed through Chinese state-backed banks offering concessional terms laced with strategic concessions, exclusive maintenance rights, technology lock-ins, tied procurement, and long service contracts that anchor Chinese operators deep inside national transport systems. Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and other analysts have noted that many Belt and Road Initiative projects are only marginally viable on commercial terms, making restructuring and follow-on rescue lending a tool for reasserting leverage rather than loosening it. Environmental degradation as collateral. Environmental safeguards are often the first casualty of Chinese-backed infrastructure. In southern Peru, Chinese-funded port developments at Marcona and Chancay have triggered sustained objections from fishers, local communities, and conservation groups over threats to wetlands, fisheries, and coastal ecosystems. Civil society organizations have criticized environmental impact studies as rushed or incomplete and have accused companies of sidelining local consultation. The pattern extends beyond ports. In Nicaragua, the now-canceled Chinese-led Interoceanic Grand Canal concession became a symbol of governance failure. A $50 billion project granted sweeping expropriation powers, associated with deforestation, land grabs, and the displacement or intimidation of indigenous and peasant communities. Even after the concession was formally revoked, regional human rights bodies have condemned the damage and ordered the government to guarantee consultation and redress for affected communities. These are not isolated incidents, they reflect a recognizable operating model. Bilateral agreements prioritize speed and financing over scrutiny. Host state ministries, eager for quick capital, often waive or dilute environmental and social safeguards. In that model, environmental degradation and social displacement become acceptable collateral in Beijing's pursuit of strategic infrastructure. Exporting opacity, the governance model. China's infrastructure diplomacy exports a governance model that favors opacity over accountability. While the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has adopted a formal environmental and social framework and moved toward more transparent procurement rules that broadly mirror other multilateral development banks, traditional Belt and Road projects are typically financed through state policy banks or commercial lenders under confidential bilateral deals. Parliamentary oversight, competitive tendering, and access to information norms are the exception, not the rule. In Southeast Asia, public backlash in Malaysia and Thailand has already forced renegotiation, scaling back, or cancellation of high-profile Chinese rail projects when costs ballooned and opaque terms came to light. In much of South America, by contrast, fragmented oversight and weak regulatory frameworks still allow Chinese companies to operate in the seams between ministries, state-owned enterprises, and subnational authorities. The issue is not whether China can change. It is whether host nations are willing and able to compel transparency, publish contracts, and align foreign financing with domestic law. Dual-use infrastructure, civilian facade, strategic intent. Infrastructure built under the guise of development often masks military and intelligence ambitions. The U.S. Southern Command has repeatedly warned Congress that Chinese-built ports, railways, telecommunications, and space facilities in the Western Hemisphere can be quickly repurposed for dual use, supporting logistics, surveillance, and power projection in a crisis. China's growing network of space and observation facilities in southern South America illustrates this risk. In Argentina's Neuquén province, the Espacio Lejano Deep Space Ground Station, built and operated by entities tied to China's military space apparatus, provides telemetry, tracking, and command capabilities under a 50-year agreement that Argentine lawmakers and U.S. officials have criticized as opaque and largely beyond national oversight. In Chile's Atacama Desert, the planned Venturones Observatory has come under review amid U.S. and Chilean concerns that a nominally scientific facility could also track satellites and enhance China's southern hemisphere space awareness. Combined with Chinese-built deep-water ports like Chancay, long-term rail concessions, and control over critical digital infrastructure, these sites offer strategic value far beyond their civilian labels. In each case, host country visibility into operations and data flows remains limited. That asymmetry is the point: democratic resistance and bargaining power. Recent research in international studies quarterly backs what activists on the ground already sense. Democratic institutions significantly constrain China's contracting power abroad. Authors Andrea Gazzelli and Pippa Morgan find a negative relationship between the strength of democratic institutions and the volume of infrastructure contracts awarded to Chinese companies, and show that joining the Belt and Road can actually trigger blowback in democracies as parliaments, courts, media, and civil society push back against opaque deals. In Latin America, that dynamic is starting to surface. In Colombia, the flagship Regiotram de Occidente light rail project, awarded to a Chinese-led consortium, has seen repeated delays, renegotiations, and political scrutiny over timelines, land transfers, and contract conditions. In Argentina, Chinese-financed dams in Patagonia and associated rail and swap arrangements have been slowed or partially halted amid environmental concerns, fiscal stress, and public debate over clauses that tie project finance to broader sovereign obligations. Democracy, when empowered, does not automatically block Chinese finance, but it can change the price. Investigative journalism, independent courts, and mobilized communities increase the political cost of secrecy and make it harder for Beijing and local elites to treat infrastructure as a closed-door transaction. A counter-playbook for sovereignty. The Chinese Communist Party's rail diplomacy is evolving, from flashy megaprojects to quieter tactics centered on procurement, standards, and maintenance contracts that embed dependence over time. For host nations, resilience will require more than broad warnings about debt traps. It needs a concrete playbook applied deal by deal. At a minimum, that means demanding full publication of financing and operational clauses, mandating independent audits and community consultation on environmental and labor standards, tying long-term concessions to clear performance benchmarks, and insisting on genuine technology transfer and local capacity building rather than perpetual reliance on foreign technicians. None of those safeguards is revolutionary, and they do not inherently exclude Chinese companies. But they shift the basis of cooperation from political discretion to rule-bound oversight, making it harder for any external power, China, the United States, or others, to turn infrastructure into a lever of quiet coercion. Infrastructure is not neutral. Railways are vectors of influence, not just cargo. Final warning: the CCP's infrastructure diplomacy in South America is not a partnership. It's a power play. From debt entrenchment and environmental degradation to dual-use militarization and contractual opacity, the rails, ports, and ground stations now under construction carry more than goods. They carry a governance model engineered for control. The illusion of cooperation collapses under scrutiny. What remains is a quiet architecture of dominance, built not with steel alone, but with silence, secrecy, and strategic intent. Whether South America's democracies can turn that architecture into something more accountable will depend less on what Beijing promises next and more on how firmly they insist that any future rails, ports, or antennas be built on their terms, in daylight and under the rule of law.